Welcome, welcome. We'll get started momentarily. Just want to give everyone the opportunity to get logged in. But as you enter, go ahead and enter your name, your organization, your role, and where you're joining us from today. We're going to wait about one more minute and then we will begin our webinar. As you guys get logged in, just drop us in the chat what your name is, where you're from, what your title is in that organization. Hi, Susie and Jamie, welcome. Susie, thank you for your service as an educator. We have some educators joining us now and some former educators today, so we appreciate you and look forward to having you with us today. All right, welcome to our MTSS webinar series. I'm Kyla Coram, Marketing Events Manager here at Aperture Education. Thank you for taking the time to join us today as we learn together. Before we begin, let's go over some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive a copy of the recording at the end of the presentation to review or share with your colleagues. Dr. Lisa Micou will also provide all the resources from today's webinar in our post-event email. If you're having trouble seeing the screen, you first should exit full screen view. If you still can't see the slides, you can double click on the small icon at the top middle of your screen and it should bring up the slide deck. For this presentation, we recommend that you select speaker view at the top right of your screen. You should also see 4 functions at the bottom. We will utilize the chat box throughout today's session. The chat box can be used to provide answers to Lisa's questions and engage with each other. Go ahead and give it a try if you haven't already. Tell us where you're from, what organization, what your title is. If you have any questions today, we're going to use the Q&A box. We will answer all of the questions at the end of Lisa's presentation. Closed captioning is also available. You can toggle that on or off at your discretion. And finally, the raise hand function. This feature can be used if there are any tech issues. If you raise your hands, I will send you a private chat to address any issues. All right, leading our webinar today is Dr. Lisa Micou. Dr. Micou is a partnership manager at Aperture Education and comes to us today with a wealth of expertise from several different roles within the education space. Lisa, welcome. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Kyla. It's so awesome to be engaging with some of you again and some of you for the first time. We've spent the last few sessions exploring different components of the MTSS framework and how it can help us to solve seemingly intractable problems in education. In April, we focused on using that decision-making framework to more comprehensively understand the learning loss that we've seen from students post-pandemic. In May, we took time to analyze different types of data you can use within that framework, what information that data point can give, and what questions you can answer with it. In June, we explored how to partner with students using a strengths-based approach to maximize student engagement. So today, we're going to focus on supporting students at advanced tiers, tiers 2 and 3, and how to use good decision-making to make us more responsive and less reactive. So our goals during this webinar are to identify what advanced tiers should look like most effectively, explore the benefits of starting with a strengths-based lens for support, and experience strong decision-making through a problem-solving cycle. But let's start with a welcoming routine, a reflection to get us thinking. I want you to think about the decision-making processes we use in schools to support students. How often have we sat in meetings, talked about students, thrown ideas together, and then wonder 6 months later why we still haven't moved the needle? In a school year, one of the most scarce and precious resources is time. When we're making decisions about how to support students socially and emotionally, I think many of us have found ourselves in the position of having to react to the need in front of us versus using data proactively to support students before they get in that first fight or need a threat assessment. So evaluating and refining our decision-making processes helps us to be more responsive to the needs of students, reducing the frequency of having to react. This shift does not happen haphazardly, though. It takes intentional planning and reflection. As in this quote from Albert Einstein, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So let's take stock of where we're starting from. Kyla is going to post a poll so that we can find out where everybody's at. The question is, based on your current outcomes, how confident are you that your current decision-making framework, especially for social-emotional well-being, is as effective and efficient as it could be? So let's see where everybody's at. Just about got everybody responding. All right. So we see a lot of variability, and I have to be honest with you, I appreciate your transparency, because you're right. A lot of people are in different places with that MTSS framework, and it's really difficult to take that time to reflect and improve. So thank you so much for joining us so that we can hopefully give you some resources to be able to reflect and improve that decision-making framework for yourself. So in thinking about that process, though, I want you to take a moment to do a little bit more reflection. What do you notice as your biggest barrier to effective decision making? So just take a moment and think. And then go ahead and put something in the chat box. What do you notice as your biggest barrier to effective decision making? Thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, thank you, Susie. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, thank you, Janice. A lot of different responses. I was expecting a lot of people to give me time. You surprised me a little bit. I appreciate you really digging deep. This is a really great responses. So if you haven't done so already, take a second to look at the different responses that are in the chat, because this will be a great opportunity to really just share out, and please feel free to engage in communication in the chat. But let's go ahead and keep moving. So most of us are very familiar with MTSS and know that a multi-tiered system of support is a systemic, prevention-focused approach to education that addresses the needs of all students through data-driven systems and services. It draws from a public health model. Now, we put things in place universally that research tells us are good for all students so that we can set them up for success. Now, in the social emotional world, that means that we ensure that we use practices that will meet people's basic and psychological needs, including the need for competence in their social and emotional skills, which looks like, I know that I can do the thing that you're asking me to do, and that will result in a positive and productive outcome for me. So a well-functioning MTSS framework is one that I can make decisions to support students as they seamlessly flow up and down that triangle. You'll notice also that a well-functioning MTSS framework should overlap and build on each other. For some students, universal practices are great, but maybe not enough. However, an efficient and effective MTSS framework allows students to access sound and effective support quickly and effectively, leaving students less time to practice unproductive responses that could get them into trouble. To make efficient and effective and responsive decisions, we need good data. that will answer the questions of who needs support, what support do they need, and is the support we are providing making an impact based on the expected outcome. The ultimate goal of any MTSS framework is to see that when students require more support, we give it to them. We monitor that it's working to achieve the goal we set, and then we fade those supports as students show success. So let's take a moment to look at what components are essential to set that universal foundation of meeting the social and emotional needs of students. So setting a foundation for social emotional well-being means that you've attended, again, to those basic safety and psychological needs. We do that through attending to the environment, creating predictable and consistent routines and procedures, by establishing school-wide expectations, co-creating norms with students about how we agree to be with each other. This provides both physical and emotional safety. We also intentionally build relationships to generally build a sense of community and connectedness, but also to create support networks for both kids and adults. And we do this through a myriad of welcoming practices like greeting students at the door or using circles. Finally, there has to be an intentional focus on building social emotional skills to support students' social emotional competence and self-efficacy. That belief in their ability to succeed academically, socially, and emotionally. Now, this typically occurs through explicit social emotional instruction, intentional practice of skills, and generalization of skills between school and home. Focusing on these universal components help to create a trauma-sensitive foundation of prevention and proactive response to meet the psychological needs that we all have. Sometimes we can make the mistake of thinking we can focus on one or two components, but not all. These components are interrelated and work together to support adults and students holistically. So let's take an example of safe and predictable environments. When we create school-wide expectations, that helps to create safety through predictability and provides adults with a common language in order to provide kind, specific, and helpful feedback to students about how they are doing demonstrating those expectations through a paired practice called pre-correction and behavior-specific praise. However, when I look at my classroom rules, like you see on the screen, just an example, what does, for example, be ready to learn mean? Well, being ready to learn may require me to be able to identify my skill strengths and needs through self-awareness. It may require me to use my self-management skills to manage my nervousness when we're learning a skill that I'm not yet proficient in. It may require me to use my responsible decision-making skills to ask for support in a way that will elicit help from an adult versus getting me sent to the office. If we approach social emotional skill building or competence from a purely behavioral standpoint, we tend to focus on compliance to expectations and thereby creating a predictable environment, but we may miss the underlying cause for why students are not successfully meeting those expectations. Students need these to be able to do these. So let's reflect for a moment on those universal practices. Drop a link in the chat to a graphic organizer you can use to jot down ideas now or later. Right now it's view only, so make sure that you make a copy of the document for yourself. But I want you to just take a moment. Think of the practices that you have in place that support the creation of a safe and predictable environment, practices that support the building of relationships and community, practices that support the teaching and reinforcement of social-emotional skills. So as you're thinking about those practices, I want you to think about, are those universal practices and core social-emotional instruction, are they supporting at least 80% of students? How do you know? Are they supporting students equitably? How do you know? Are universal practices and core social-emotional instruction implemented with integrity How does this impact your outcomes? And based on data, what do students need? What skills do we need to teach, reteach, reinforce? So all of those questions require good data. What data are you using to make those determinations, be able to answer those reflections? And what is the goal based on that data point to ensure that you're truly making an impact? Will that data point allow you to reliably, quickly, and effectively identify students who need more? Will that data tell you exactly what they need? So I've given you a lot to think about. This is just to get your brain started. Please feel free to use these kind of questions in that organizer later to really start to really think through the universal practices that you have in place and to really start to analyze those. Because again, that sets your foundation. So for students who do need more, traditionally, we have focused on social emotional well-being from the perspective of an absence of risk indicators. However, an absence of risk does not equate to or guarantee the presence of social emotional assets. When we focus on building skills that will foster resilience, this will positively impact all of those best practices that you probably identified that we use in education. It benefits students' ability to follow school-wide expectations through PBIS, to repair harm when it occurs through restorative practices, to fully engage with instruction and promote student engagement and attendance. We already have plenty of data in districts that measure risk. You probably have several that you associated with some of those practices that you identified. We have data such as attendance, grades, nurse visits, behavior referrals, suspensions, mental health screeners, and others that I could probably name. But what many districts lack is a way to reliably determine whether they are in fact building students' social emotional skills strengths to create a more comprehensive picture of social emotional well-being. Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology, is quoted as saying, "I believe psychology has done very well in working out how to understand and treat disease. But I think that is literally half-baked. If all you do is work to fix problems to alleviate suffering, then by definition, you are working to get people to zero, to neutral." When we react to student issues that rise to the surface, this is oftentimes what we end up doing. In order to change course, we have to approach social emotional well-being from a stance of identifying what skills students are demonstrating and what skills need to be strengthened to prevent kids from relying on unproductive responses. And we need to do that from an asset-based lens. We don't have time to continue to talk about the symptoms of the problem. And that's what behavior is. It's just a symptom. If we focus on deficits and risks, it distracts us from the good work of problem solving and keeps us in the realm of admiring the problem. We need to focus on the underlying reason for the symptom, which is often a function of one of two things. First, students may have social emotional skills in their repertoire, but they're just not using them often enough, indicating that students may need support in identifying what those skill strengths are so that kids know where they're starting from and they know that we know it. This gives them a path to grow and builds their self-efficacy or the belief that they can make that growth happen. A second scenario is that the student does not yet have those specific skills in their repertoire. But from an asset-based lens, we know that they have other skills that could be leveraged in order to enhance those growth opportunities. Viewing students from an asset-based lens helps us to keep our focus on the ultimate goal, which is to build their social emotional assets. By building assets, we increase students' ability to use their skills in all contexts, ultimately reducing their need to use less productive responses that typically are the hallmark of those risk indicators. So not all data is created equal. For our MTSS decision-making framework to work efficiently and effectively, we have to have data that allows us to see quickly and reliably whether our foundational practices are serving to build social-emotional assets in our students. We can ask kids about their self-perceptions and how they feel they are doing, but the best way to identify whether kids are using their skills is to observe whether kids are using their skills. Of all the tools out there, one of the strongest tools available is the Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment, or DESA. It's a standardized norm reference rating scale of student social-emotional competence. In 60 seconds, DESA mini data can predict whether that student needs more, and that's before they ever receive their first office referral. Peer-reviewed studies have found that students identify in the need for instruction range by the DESA mini at the beginning of the year are 450% more likely to be suspended or expelled by the end of the school year if we did nothing. But having strong data helps educators implement true proactive support instead of waiting until a student is referred for problem solving or for special education. It helps us to establish a well-oiled MTSS machine. So now let me introduce you to Mandy Couturier, the MTSS director in Harwood Unified Union School District in Vermont, who is doing this work and doing it well. Mandy began her career in schools working as a one-to-one for a student who won her heart and solidified her career in education. She received a master's degree in special education and a second advanced degree in emotional behavioral disorders, both from Riviera College. I don't know if I said that right. Please forgive me, Mandy, if I didn't. Mandy worked as a special educator in Massachusetts, and then in 2008 moved to Vermont to join the Harwood School District. She spent 10 years at Brookside Primary School, first as a full-time special educator, and then as a hybrid behavior specialist, collaborating with her fellow educators to meet the needs of all students. She's been at the forefront of the school's state-recognized school-wide PBIS team as a school coordinator for 9 years. She was instrumental in the design and implementation of their advisory time called the NEST, Now Everyone Succeeds Together. And she was awarded the Golden Apple Award in 2012 for team excellence in special education. And in 2018, Mandy became the principal of Moortown Elementary School, and she was thrilled to continue to work in a school and district that was committed to students' social and emotional needs. During her time as principal, she worked on a school-wide and district-wide systems in the social emotional realm. This included acting as co-chair for the district's specialized task force for social emotional learning from 2019 to now. And Mandy's passions include creating systems for all students to get what they need to be successful and for all students and staff to have a sense of belonging. And she's actually really excited to start her new district role this year as director of MTSS, which will allow this important work to continue under her leadership. Welcome, Mandy.
Hello, welcome. I'm hoping that I'm in an empty office, but all of a sudden there's people around me, so I'm hoping there's not going to be too much noise. But if I suddenly mute, it's to ask people to quiet down.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about how DESA data has helped you all in Harwood to measure impact of your universal practices.
Yeah, we were really excited. We did a lot of research and found DESA because we were looking for something to get really good baseline data, right? Pre-COVID and then during COVID, we struck while the iron was hot. It was a perfect time to sign on and to really dive into DESA and look at that data. And so we did it district-wide, although I was a school-based, obviously, principal at the time. It was like my pet project and was really excited to start looking at some data because we didn't really have anything that indicated whether we were doing a good job or not. And so we had lots of things going on, but not a lot of indicator of how it was all going. So DESA was brought on for that reason.
That's awesome. So it sounds like you used DESA data to help you kind of monitor your implementation integrity of some of those best practices that you were using.
Exactly, exactly. We wanted it to be something that was in place that said, okay, how are we doing now? But what if we put other things in place? Will the DESA data indicate that those things are worth our time and effort, basically?
So how did using this kind of data school-wide, how did that help you build buy-in with educators? Because that's oftentimes a very prioritized concern for district leaders.
So, I mean, it's never easy to get buy-in initially, right? And whenever we bring in something new, I think that one of the reasons that folks were open to talk about DESA data is oftentimes it mirrored what they kind of knew. And, we're a small school, overall a small district. And so there's a lot of knowledge that we already have about students, right? You talked about those risk factors. We know these things. We know who kids are when they walk in. And the DESA helped reinforce what we already knew and gave insight into the things that we maybe hadn't thought of yet. And I found that really helpful.
Thank you so much, Mandy. So let's start to think about, we've set a foundation. So now let's move up that triangle to those advanced tiers. So having good social-emotional data will help us to quickly determine how well we're doing supporting student social-emotional competence generally, but it will also tell us whether there's a need for additional support, for whom and where that need is. And one of the challenges in a tiered framework is reliably identifying which students would benefit from Tier 2 support and what that support should look like. Now, there are many slightly different but similar descriptions of criteria for effective Tier 2 interventions, but it comes down to accessibility, alignment, and layering and data. When we intervene early and intentionally using reliable proactive data, we can then oftentimes prevent problems from escalating. This also provides us with an opportunity to reteach or reinforce social-emotional skills to help students learn more productive responses and how they approach challenging situations that most likely resulted in them being flagged for needing support. One of the disadvantages to using risk-based data to make this determination is that we're waiting for students to use unproductive responses in order for us to intervene, rather than using data that shows us that they're simply not yet demonstrating their productive social-emotional skills as strengths. So using reliable and valid data to measure observable social-emotional skills helps us to create systems that are seamless and efficient for providing support to students who need more. So let's look at an example. So as a third grade team, let's pretend we just finished our fall data collection with the DESA Mini and DESA. We completed a DESA Mini 1-minute screener on all of our students. Based on the results, 21% of our students noted in that green area are demonstrating their social-emotional skills a majority of the time based on what teachers observe in the classroom. So this is a celebration. 67% of students in the blue typical range are demonstrating their social-emotional skills a typical amount of time. But this could be strengthened, which means we may want to examine how often we are intentionally and explicitly giving kids opportunities to practice their skills throughout the instructional day. 12% of our students noted in red are demonstrating a need for more instruction than what we are providing universally. Because, though, only 12% of our students need more, that also tells us that our universal supports are having an impact. Because we are using DESA data, we can be assured that the cut score for determining a need for more is not arbitrary, but is statistically determined based on a T-score, ensuring that we are supporting students who need the support. And remember, what this data is telling us is that the third graders who have a need for more instruction are just simply not demonstrating the skills yet, setting us up beautifully for a focus on assets and growth rather than deficits. For those students who need more, we then completed a full DESA to be able to drill down and look at which competencies we needed to focus on. By only having completed full DESAs on 12% of the grade level, I've saved a huge amount of time in determining who needs more, what the need is. For those students who need more, let's look at their data. So here's a breakdown of the need for instruction by competency. Of the students who need more, you can see that the majority of those students are demonstrating their self-awareness skills much of the time. In fact, 75% of the students we've identified as needing more are demonstrating their self-awareness skills a typical amount of time. I wonder what universal practices are in place to support this. I wonder if we could leverage students' abilities for self-awareness to then build on their areas of growth. Now, in looking at the data, I can see that there are two competencies showing the greatest area of need. Based on your analysis of the data, what are those two areas? Where would you start? So Kyla will post a poll so that we can use our good decision-making skills for Tier 2 support. So the question is, where is the need? Where do we start? You tell me, pick two competencies that we should start with. All right, I got a half of people's responding. And keep in mind, the blue area means these kids are in the typical range. So that's a good thing. So self-awareness is actually a relative strength for these students. The red would be needs for instruction. So you're looking for the two areas that have the highest need for instruction. And right now I've got about 10 out of 15 people responded. And it looks like we have self-management and social awareness as our highest need areas. And I would agree. Those are the two areas that we might start with, because those are the two highest areas of need for our students. So when we're thinking about that third grade team, that's where we're going to focus. Thank you so much for responding. I so appreciate, again, your willingness to join us in this decision-making framework. All right, so based on my data for my third graders, I can then use data-driven recommendations to enhance existing strengths and to teach targeted skills, either through lessons in the classroom or through small group instruction, to really help to layer on to those universal practices. Now, when we reach Tier 3, we're oftentimes working with students who've already demonstrated risk indicators, and they're using unproductive responses that are getting them into trouble academically and maybe social emotionally. However, a well-functioning MTSS framework means that for Tier 3 support, we really should only be planning for about 5% or less of our student population. For that to happen, we need to ensure that our universal practices and our Tier 2 supports are implemented with integrity, such that our educators feel confident and competent in implementing those practices, and that those practices are monitored for impact. So if our goal is to increase student social-emotional skills, are we doing it? One of the most frustrating moments for a teacher who is struggling with a student is to come to a problem-solving team or a student support team or whatever you happen to call it, ask for help, and then feel like they're not being supported because they're told that they need to try some interventions first before going to the level of individualized support. Likewise, it's equally frustrating for a student support team who is stretched thin to try and support a teacher student by student when effective universal and Tier 2 supports have not been implemented. That is a no-win situation, setting everyone up to feel defeated. But now imagine a teacher coming to a problem-solving meeting ready with student social-emotional skill data and documentation of what strategies he or she has implemented already based on that data and the outcome of that intervention. Now we can confidently support that educator and student with Tier 3 supports that we know will be individualized based on that student's needs and will be aligned to what supports are in place at Tiers 1 and 2. So let's briefly walk down the road of Tier 3 support. For that, let me introduce you to a student. Meet Cameron. By the way, Cameron is not a real student as far as I know, but for these purposes, let's pretend. Cameron was originally in the group receiving Tier 2 supports starting in the winter of 2023. Data indicated that he was showing growth, but it was only a small T-score change. So based on this T-score growth, we can confidently determine that we need to intensify and individualize for this student. For Cameron, when I drill down into his most recent rating, I see that the teacher rated Cameron as having a relative strength. There we go, a relative strength in relationship skills through an individual item analysis. I'm sorry, I got myself all turned around. Through an individual item analysis, I can see that he frequently expresses concerns for others. So empathy is a strength for him. However, under self-management, which is a relative need for him, he rarely thinks before he acts and never stays calm when faced with a challenge, at least that the teacher observed. PBIS referral data also bears that out based on the number of conflicts he's had with students on the playground. So we'll start with his strength in empathy and build on that to help him learn to see others' perspectives in problem solving, while also teaching and practicing a self-management strategy to keep calm so that he can then problem solve effectively in the moment. So my point is, there's no guesswork where to start. And now we also have a path to partner with Cameron based on his strength so that he can take ownership of his learning, since he'll know where he's starting from and how to grow from there. This sets the stage for a growth mindset. Supporting social and emotional well-being from a strengths-based lens at all tiers allows us to more productively partner with students and reinforce the power of yet. It allows us to get ahead of difficulties that students may be having and proactively address needs before they escalate and worsen. We can then proactively practice more productive responses to challenging situations, creating a resiliency effect that will support positive mental health as students age. So let's return to Mandy and see how a strengths-based approach has supported and enhanced Harwood Unified's approach to advanced tiers. Welcome back, Mandy.
Hi there.
So as someone who's led several school teams from different perspectives, tell us a little about your process of identifying students who need more, like what teams use this data and how those conversations look.
So we use it on multiple levels, honestly. And so obviously I had access to all of it, and we used the all three windows. So we had a time where we would review it. We did it in what we called MTSS meetings, which were grade-based or grade paired. Our schools are small, so we have a 3-4 team. And so we would look at it. We had weekly MTSS meetings, which I know some people are like, wow, that's a lot. And it was really well used because we could talk about all of the needs or all of the things going on for students, not just math or not just, those sort of things. So we looked at those teams, which was great because those were the MTSS teams is where they were making what we called win groups. And that what I need block of time, that was a sacred time during every day, was really based on instructional need. And so we were able to match students with in groups based on what they showed they need instruction for using the DESA. We also looked at DESA as a whole school because we were a small school. That was possible. Without identifying individual students, we looked more at trends in classes and grades. But we were able to see, we used those breakouts of the competencies, and we were able to see that although, we had maybe a larger number of students who were struggling in one area, that relationship skills area was very high overall for the entire school, and we were able to look at that as a really a huge success about the instruction that we were delivering on the whole, which felt really good as a whole school team.
That's awesome. And I'm curious, like, so how has having a focus on strengths, how has that changed some of the conversations that you are hearing in those teams?
I think what you said is really spot on. It's where to start, right? Like build from what the students are doing well, and how do we see a window in? Kids don't. It's harder for kids to go to the extra instruction when they feel like it's hard or that they're not good at it, right? So if you build in the things that they're really good at into the instruction about the harder things, you build in something called behavior momentum, which is a behavior term, but also it really helps build up that student's sense of success because they're like, oh, I can do this. I'm good at this. A kid like Cameron that you showed, we had a couple of kids like that could build those relationships, but struggled with that with some of the other areas. And if you build off that relationship and they can work with someone that they care about and cares about them, you see a lot more growth in those areas.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And it really sounds like that students are then able to partner more effectively and really, really, really take a little bit of ownership of that growth.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I didn't mention earlier, but we, as a group, as our task force, really focused in on the competencies that DESA put out and did some intentional help around what those competencies actually mean, because there was some confusion on some of the parts of the professionals, the staff, about like, what does that actually mean? Optimistic thinking, what does that actually mean? And so we pushed out information not only to the staff, but also to the families about what does this mean? What can you do? Little doses, we had one section in our family newsletter about like conversation starters in the car or during dinner around optimistic thinking, so that it didn't feel like a huge undertaking. And also we kept building on the things that students could do to build towards that strength, go from that typical to that strength. So I'm afraid I got off track a little bit because it really was like a learning experience for everyone involved. Like, what does this actually mean when you say social awareness, and how can we best teach it to the students and give that universal and or other tiered instruction?
That's awesome. So we've taken a lot of time to really go through those different tiers, but once you put supports in place, one of the things that we have to focus on is, are we making an impact? And so let's take a little bit of time to go through that piece of it. So an important part of any problem-solving cycle is being able to reliably determine whether our student is responding to the intervention we have in place. And our ability to confidently evaluate response to instruction helps us to streamline our supports and make fiscally responsible decisions about resources. In the academic world, the standard for progress monitoring has for many years been curriculum-based measurement, or CBM. CBM is a powerful, reliable, valid, and sensitive measurement approach to use to screen students and to monitor student progress in basic skills in math, reading, writing, and spelling. With CBM, teachers and schools can assess individual responsiveness to academic instruction. They're standardized, simple, short-duration fluency measures that allow for frequent formative assessment of academic skill growth. And they're designed to function as academic thermometers to monitor student growth in important skills that are relevant to school outcomes. So you may be thinking to yourself, that's great. Are there CBMs for social, emotional, behavioral skills? The short answer, no. Social emotional competence is a bit more challenging to measure. It is multifaceted, and it presents as different skills in different settings and contexts. And we often don't provide instruction in social emotional skill growth as frequently as we do academic instruction. So social emotional skill growth takes time. What we use needs to align with the critical features of assessment that have utility in a problem-solving model. So let's take a look at those critical features. To effectively problem solve about students who need social and emotional support, we need an assessment that is first and foremost defensible. This means that the assessment tool has reliability and is valid for the intended use. In other words, it's psychometrically sound. The second is flexibility, meaning that it can guide a variety of assessment situations, such as identification of a need and growth over time. The third is efficiency, meaning that it requires minimal resources to implement and is practical. And finally, it's repeatable, meaning that it can be used repeatedly over time in order to show growth over time. Now, because of their convenience, cost effectiveness, and sound psychometric properties, one of the most prominent tools used to assess social emotional behavioral skill is rating scales. The biggest challenge based on current knowledge of behavioral assessment has been the balance of defensibility with flexibility, efficiency, and repeatability. So let me introduce you to the DESA Mini as a tool for social emotional progress monitoring. So the DESA Mini is a psychometrically sound screener of social emotional competence. It meets the universal screener criteria set forth by the World Health Organization, making it a tool that provides highly defensible data. It is a teacher rating scale based on everyday observations in the classroom and takes 1 minute a student to complete, making it very efficient. Peer-reviewed articles have found that the DESA Mini can identify students who have a need for more support with 95% accuracy and can be used to measure meaningful growth over time based on change of T-scores. So it's very flexible. And finally, there are 4 alternate equivalent forms, making it repeatable throughout the school year, allowing you to show growth over time. At times, you may want to measure more specific skill growth, like you would in, say, reading. Now remember, oral reading fluency is a general outcome measure for overall reading, but oral reading fluency is still made up of multiple skills, such as reading rate, expression, accuracy, prosody. So what would you do if you wanted to measure progress of more discrete social emotional skills? Well, for that, you may want to pair a DESA Mini with other assessment methods, such as direct behavior rating or direct observation, to provide you with more formative but contextual information to provide an even more comprehensive picture for problem solving. So now let's bring Mandy back into the conversation and see how she has used DESA for measuring growth over time. All right, Mandy. So tell me, how have you used DESA data to show student growth over time?
In lots of different ways. So like I said, we brought it on in 2020 to get a baseline, right? So we wanted to figure out, where are we starting with this? And because we had lots of great things going on, we just didn't know if any of them were actually hitting the mark and actually changing outcomes for students. And so I can speak mostly to what we did at my school at the time, and so that's what I'll speak to. But we started looking at it. Obviously, every cycle we looked at it 3 times a year, and really looked at individual students, but we also looked at class and grade data. And so we were not shocked, but when we first did our data collection for the second graders who happened to be, they were in second grade as they came out of remote schooling and whatnot. We had 33 second graders, and I believe 11 of them showed need in most of the areas on the DESA. And we were like, okay, this is a great place to start baseline, right? We can really look closely. And to me, it was funny. I'm kind of a geek around these things, but I thought the teachers were like, well, what kind of groups are you going to do, or pull out groups? And I said, oh, no, this is not a pull out group situation. This is a whole group situation. This is, this is what's been going on in these students' lives. This is not indicative of individual student needs. This is a group need, really. And so we were really happy to see that we put in place whole group things. Many of the things we put in place were from the DESA platform, and so we pulled specific lessons to do whole group. We did some restorative circles around some topics that were needing for instruction, and we were so thrilled to see that when we did our next round of ratings for DESA, that so many of those students had moved up in many of the areas where they had struggled or showed need for more instruction, because in fact they needed more instruction, right? And so it was a great opportunity for us to see when there's a need that comes up, and you kind of use that identified need to fuel your instruction, it actually does change the outcomes for those students. And by the time those students were in 4th grade, I believe only 2 of those 12 or 11 or 12 were coming up as having needs for instruction according to the DESA data. So that's huge growth over not a whole lot of time. And I would say it was very targeted because of what the data that we could pull up.
That's awesome. Now we have an example of some data, individual student data, and I would love to know like a little bit of how having this data has helped you to partner more with families.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a
So
little bit about.
This data was awesome because this data was shared with me during an online meeting with Katie Mason, who is our Aperture, my Aperture connection, and she pulled this data up, and I said, "Oh yeah, I know that kid," and she goes, "You know which kid this is by looking at this at this graph," and I said, "Yes, I do," and so. Admittedly, I love this, and this is like what I'm passionate about and love doing. And also, admittedly, I have a small school, but I knew exactly who this student was, and I was able to track his pretty remarkable growth had to do with a couple of things. One of them being what I mentioned earlier is those WIN groups. And he during probably that 2022, where he was kind of hovering above that line, he was refusing to participate in the WIN groups that were most matched to his areas of instructional need. And so we were like, okay, so let's start looking at some of the strengths and seeing if we can build on those, make him feel a little bit better about what's going on for him. And then let's see if we can get him to join the WIN groups. And he did. And guess what? It made a pretty big difference. Yeah. So, and it was really good to see. And it was really nice to report to his family, who knew that he had struggled, in that in the area of that first dot. And there was lots of conversations that happened along the way. And it's always nice to be able to change the tone of a conversation, right? So the conversations that happened along that flat line were more like, yep, he's maintaining, he's doing okay. There's blips, there's things that come up. We're trying to get in the things that need to be there, but he's pretty resistant, but we're going to keep working on it. And then once we were able to say, hey, guess what, he joined the groups, and these are the things that were able to happen, it was really, I think, really good for them to see, and really nice for us to report, honestly.
What a way to build trust with families, that you have to be able to show them this is what we said we were going to do, and here's the data to show that it made impact.
And we didn't stop trying.
Yeah.
Like, that was the key. Like, don't just say, oh, he doesn't want to go to the groups, we're just not going to do it. Like, we're going to make it enticing.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your journey and your just experience that you've had with students and the success that you have seen.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I have really enjoyed the partnership that our district have had with Aperture now for a few years, and it's going well. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. So let's bring this to a close. So throughout our time today, we took time to identify what advanced tiers should look like most effectively. We explored the benefits of starting with a strengths-based lens for support. And we also experienced using good data to support strong decision-making through a problem-solving cycle. And in summary, in order to streamline our MTSS framework and ensure that we are being more responsive than reactive, we need to implement and reflect on fidelity and impact of practices at all levels, ensure we're using good data to measure growth in social-emotional skills to accompany risk data, and proactively use social-emotional data that is defensible, efficient, flexible, and repeatable. All this to ensure that we maximize our precious and scarce resources, time, money, and most importantly, people. So now it's your turn. Take a moment and think. In reflecting on all you learned today, what is your aha moment, your key takeaway? Just think. And if you feel comfortable, put something in the chat. So as we're letting people respond, I'm going to move on because I see that we're running a little bit short on time and I want to make sure we get any questions answered. Yeah, thank you, Susie. I see that response. So if you have ideas that you would like to submit to us for other things that you want to learn about, please don't hesitate to give us feedback on this form. There's a QR code on the screen. I think Kyla just put that also in the chat. But Kyla, let me turn it back to you and see if there are any questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. That was great, Lisa and Mandy. It's always lovely to hear customer stories, and we appreciate you. Right now, we have a question from Keenan, and Keenan is curious, how often can you give the DESA Mini or the full DESA?
So typically you're giving the DESA Mini probably about once a month. And the reason that is because, again, you're looking at how often are you giving that instruction to give it time to actually have an impact. So depending on, again, how intense that intervention is, typically we recommend about once a month. You could do a DESA Mini just as it, like, again, that quick temperature check to see how that total social emotional competence is growing. You could also use the DESA Full, but unfortunately, there's only one version of the DESA Full. So if you want to be able to use quick progress monitoring data that you can then alternate and reduce any practice effects for teachers, you want to use that DESA Mini.
Awesome. That is the only question we've had submitted right now. I think we're getting some more responses into your reflection in the chat box, though.
Yeah, I love these responses because really that's exactly what I was hoping people would leave with, really starting with those strengths. That if we can start with that, you heard Mandy talk about, we can pull students in to be a partner with us in that growth process. Because a lot of times when we react, we're butting heads with students. And that really makes it more difficult to make growth. But if we can grab their attention and grab their motivation and help them to be partners with us, we can see really amazing things happen. Looking at Stephanie, just put something else about strengths-based approach. Yes, to be able to use that strength to expand on targeted skills. It makes it a lot more streamlined. So if I can start with a strength and I can know exactly where we need to grow, then we can really narrow in on where do we start. Because a lot of times as a school psychologist, a lot of times one of the frustrating things was I knew what the kid was doing unproductively. I could walk in a classroom and tell you that. What I needed to know was what positive prosocial behaviors do we need to start with, teach, reinforce, generalize. That was always the struggle is trying to figure that out. So having data that can really give us right to the heart of what we need to problem solve about is really helpful.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you, Lisa, for sharing your expertise with us today. And Mandy, we appreciate you sharing your SEL journey with us. Good luck on your new role. We can't wait to hear all the success that you're going to have. And thank you, attendees, for joining us. We are going to send a follow-up email with a recording of this presentation, as well as resources within 24 hours. Thank you all for what you have done and continue to do for our education system. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye. And I was about to end the webinar, Lisa, but we have a question that came in from Stephanie. Can we just answer that real quick for her?
I was really hoping you'd see this.
Yeah.
So Stephanie, actually, one of the best examples that I give is like when you talk about students who, whatever that strength happens to be, like I have an example student that I oftentimes use. When a student can, let's say they are really good at responding to when students are in need. So they're like, they develop empathy, right? They can really look to see if a student needs support, comfort, they go to that student. So they have that foundation of empathy. But in the heat of the moment, let's say in the cafeteria, hallway, whatever, if in that challenging situation, they don't necessarily have a strategy to calm themselves, to be able to use that empathy skill to then problem solve. So that's where you start from. You celebrate the fact that they have empathy, build on that to then say, okay, let's practice a self-calming strategy so that you can then tap into that empathy to be able to see that other person's perspective. So that's just a real quick example that I oftentimes will share with people. Hope that answers the question.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for submitting that question. I'm glad we could grab that in real quickly. All right. Well, if you have any additional questions you come up with later, please feel free to email Lisa. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. We appreciate you all and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you. Bye-bye.